All right. Hello, friends and community. My name is Peter Rubin, and I am the co-founder of the Racial Reconciliation Project with Wanda Whitaker and Galen Logan. And the three of us are cooking up this workshop series for white people called Free Yourself First, that's happening in response to George Floyd's murder and this upswelling of interest and engagement with how to be a better white ally. So that's starting on August 8th. And as we lead up to our workshop, I'm doing expert interviews with people who I admire, who bring important voices to this conversation. And today's interview is with Tyler Grillo. Say hi, Tyler.
Hi, everyone.
Tyler is, to be quite formal about it, he is awesome.
Ooh.
And he's a somatic coach and shamanic practitioner who brings a real depth of sensitivity to cultural issues and the social lens around this work. He's trained by the Strozzi Institute in somatic coaching and bodywork. And I met Tyler in 2017, a few years ago, as part of a group called STAND. And what it is, it's a group of white men who are coming together to do our racial justice work. And we can share more about that. I think that was a weird concept to me originally. It's like, what, just white men getting together to do racial justice work?
Totally.
But it's an amazing thing. And Tyler was in a leadership role then. And I've been admiring you for years, Tyler, and what you bring. So today's topic is tools for action for white people. Because the question we're hearing all over is, what do I do?
Yeah.
What do I do? And I think maybe the first answer is don't do anything quite yet. There's some stuff to feel first, but there's also time for action. And we're going to get into some of the nitty gritties of what we can do. And I think this conversation is going to be really helpful to anyone watching. So that's my intro. Welcome, Tyler.
Oh, so great to be here with you, Peter. Thank you for that. Your words are too kind. I don't know if I'm an expert necessarily on this topic, but I am a fellow learner on the journey. And I absolutely am looking forward to sharing what I've learned.
Thank you. I feel the same way. I could look at certain training and point to expert status, but I've chosen not to.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels like a safer, obviously more humble and a safer place to come from because we don't know.
Yeah.
Especially as white guys.
Right.
Better not to presume too much. But you have been doing this work for a while, and let's start with your story. And maybe it starts young. I don't know when you first got interested in racial justice work, but could you tell your story?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. Well, I definitely was given some strong roots or foundation in the work through my upbringing with my parents. I would say that like many white folks in of my age group, I'm 31, so I'm a millennial. I was raised with well-intentioned, but often also the lens of like, don't see race, don't see color, right? And yet also, I was grateful to have it from my parents. Like they would speak to like there being racial inequities. So that was like, in my purview. But then I really got into specifically anti-racist work in college, really through my spiritual path. I started to, in my practices of shamanic practices, but also Buddhist, Hindu practices, and in various other meditation practices, really come into the awareness of the ways that just generally society has conditioned all of us, but me and my experience in ways that aren't necessarily who I really authentically am, right? Or who I want to be. And so as I went to Sarah Lawrence College, which has a history of some activism. So it was pretty present there. And so being in that milieu, I kind of just was like, oh, right. Like the way in which white supremacy and patriarchy and these various forms of oppression and privilege have been either installed in me or shaped me in these various ways. Like those are other forms of this same pattern, right? And so for me actually to be free personally, I need to be involved with this work, right? And of course it's also essential work for bringing equality for everyone. So I also, in my story, want to always shout out a woman named Natalie Gross, a Black woman who I worked with. She was at the time the director of diversity in the student affairs at my college. And because of a job that I had, she was my boss. And she just continued to call me in to various meetings, various organizing groups. And that was really when I first started doing any kind of organizing, but I would say that was more of a learning phase for me, less of the organizing itself. But, really through her, I just kept getting called into the work and learning more and more about it. I just really developed a space for, a really love for the community and like a deeper rooting into like an embodied sense of how essential this work is. And then when I moved to the Bay Area, I moved to the East Bay about 5 years ago. This is probably the most politically active place I've ever lived. I grew up in a small rural town in Colorado, mostly white. I lived in New York City for a little bit, which after college, which more racially diverse, learned a lot there just in terms of relationship with various communities, folks of different communities. But then coming to Oakland, Berkeley, was really another level for me. And I'm so eternally grateful. I landed working at a place called Strozzi Institute, as you mentioned, which also shares somatic lineage and at the time also office space with an organization called Generative Somatics, which was a similar lineage in terms of methodology, but specifically working with frontline all social justice organizers. So definitely check out their work. They're amazing. And through sharing space with them and just getting to know the folks in that organization, also they're calling me in more and more to various work. And one person specifically one time said, especially when this was during the 2016 election, like, you should organize your people. And something like a light bulb went off of like, yeah, there's space to bring in more white folks into this work. And so that's how I found Stand and got involved there. And so now I've been involved with them for about 3.5 years. So that's my story. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a rich story. And there's a lot that I'd like to point out, or a few things I'd like to point out. One is that for you, spirituality and social justice came at about the same time in your life, and they came together. So you realize the social implications of spirituality, which is different from me and many people in my community who took the spiritual route earlier on, and basically the spiritual bypass route.
Yeah, the bypass.
And later realized, oh shit, it's not just about me and my meditation cushion and what happens here.
Yeah.
So that stood out. What also stood out was your mentor Natalie early on, and how that mentorship really changed the trajectory of your life, right? Yeah. Being called in by someone, in college, and how that inspired you, right, early on to take this path. Yeah. And how each step of your career and your journey, you've been called into deeper levels and done some incredible work. So
yeah, it's really, it's the community, it's the folks who it's in the lineage of this work, right? The folks who are deeper in, and as we continue to do this work, it's always a space for me is, right, like, how can I be that person who, when I was using the wrong words or saying things with various blind spots, to have the grace of my teachers who, held my humanity and called me in and lifted me up in those spaces versus maybe calling out and shaming, because I feel like that's what really called me in and got me to continue and really find a foundation in this work. So.
So there's a lot we could talk about together.
Yes.
I want to get into action, but one more piece that I just wanted to read from your website, because I think it's important, and you do shamanic work.
Yeah.
And I think you see a white guy doing shamanic work and it's pretty easy to be skeptical, right? And I think you bring a lot of attunement to it. And I want to read this piece from your website. You wrote, "In all of my offerings, I bring a social lens developed through the work I've done around privilege, systemic oppression, and inequality for over a decade. I ground my perspective in knowing that as a cis, able-bodied white man, I have a particular location in our society that shapes how I move through the world, including how I work with others. I'm committed to the lifelong path of undoing and transforming toxic masculinity white supremacy, and other forms of oppression, both in myself and my communities. I also commit to meeting you wherever you are on your journey of developing your own social consciousness and getting to know how your various intersections of identity shape your life and your path of transformation. And, you know, I read that and I just loved it. It struck me as so essential. It's such a condensed version of what a lot of us are trying to figure out and trying to say. Could you unpack that a bit in terms of like, what do you mean by that, and how does that show up in your work? Because I think what you're speaking to is being aware of the social lens you're bringing, but there's also something very permissive and non-shaming about it. I imagine many of your clients are white, right? So say more about that and what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the invitation. It's, you know, for me, it's really that piece I was getting to of back verse. Firstly, like, you know, putting myself in shoes where when I have my blind spots, right, and that I know I still have, right, in many ways. And you know, I'm reading right now in its entirety Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy.
Great book.
So good. And one piece I was reading recently that just really stuck up to me was like, you know, we get really centered in our individual experiences of time, and that when we learn something, then people who haven't learned us are behind us, and people who know more are in front of us. But if we really step out of that individual and into a more collective experience of time, we can see that these movements of, especially like social change, cultural change and experience, are happening for different people in this different timescape, right? So if we look at it, it's like the moment that we learn something, let's say, you know, to use BIPOC, right, instead of just POC, right, this new term, right? Learning that, someone else who doesn't learn that, when they learn it, that's actually the same movement. That's that same transformation just happening in a different individual's experience. And how beautiful is that, right? They're not wrong or behind necessarily. They're just learning it as you once learned it, as I once learned it, right? So for me, when I'm working with other folks, you know, I try to really bring myself into that space, and, you know, that always takes some mindfulness and presence, right? But to just be in that, and also in a curiosity, right? A curiosity of the shape that the person's coming with, what life experiences have they had, what intersections of either privileges or oppression do they experience that have led them to this space and to this understanding, right? And with that curiosity can come, you know, a space of not neither right or wrong, but of exploration and of learning. So it's a little bit.
I really like that. I know for me, it's been a journey to embody some of that curiosity with my white brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
When I first learned about this stuff, I just wanted to educate everyone.
Yeah.
And there was some amount of judgment and guilting and shaming and saying, hey, get with the program. This is really important. It came from passion.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But I was basically shaming my white friends. And I don't think I was very fun to be around for probably a couple of years.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know I alienated some people in my community as well, you know, by doing that. And, you know, for me, that's one of the things, like strategically, if we think about it strategically, that's something that it's just not strategic. If you're trying to bring more people into this work and you're shaming them and pushing them away, right? That's not accomplishing what we're going for, right? So just from a strategic lens, it's not that call out move is often not strategic. I think it has its place, but I know that I certainly over-indexed on that at a certain point. I had to unlearn that.
Yeah, it's about remembering why we're doing this, which is, I think it's basically to be a safe harbor for our white friends, right? To process some of these confusing, complicated topics.
Yeah.
And help them get authentically inspired to act based on their values, right? And maybe they're shifting their values, but not by forcing anything down their throats. Is that?
Yeah, and that's huge what you said, like by their values, right? That piece of finding the stake in the work. Like, you know, what I said about my story is that, you know, a lot of it, I came to this work a lot for me, to be honest, you know, seeing that my own liberation is bound up here. And that is the foundation. You know, there's that Little Watson quote about that. That our liberation is bound up together. And
can I read the whole quote? I think it's a beautiful one. Geez, let me see if I can find it here.
Yeah. for folks who don't know, Lil Watson is a Aboriginal, Australian Aboriginal activist and organizer.
Mm-hmm. I think it's at, so there's a document you shared with me that Stan put out.
Oh yeah.
And I think it's in there.
Might be. There's some nice quotes there.
Give me a moment, because it's so.
Yeah, just pull it up. And I'll say in the meantime, you got it?
Yeah, she says, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together.
Every time. And so it's that piece you spoke around the values of like connecting with folks on what's important to them and how this work connects to that, right? So if we come in with the lens of I'm coming in to help others, quickly we fall into white savior complex, and we show up in a way where we're still, in a sense, I guess, othering, you know? Whereas if we're in it together, we can just really ground in what we share, that we share the inherent importance of this work.
Yeah. And you do look a bit like Jesus. So for you to say that we don't need to be saviors.
the white Jesus concept. I'll tell you all over the world, places I've traveled, white Jesus has gone far in non-white cultures.
So I can get serious for a second. So I agree with that. And, I think there's a paradox. There's a lot of contradiction and paradox in this work. And I think part of it is this work isn't about us.
Yeah.
And if we come to this work and think it's about us and our personal growth, we're missing the point.
Yeah.
But it's also not entirely about other people. If we say it's just about the liberation of people of color, we're also missing something, which is our interconnectedness. Right? And what Lila Watson so eloquently speaks to.
That's right.
So I think it's okay to have some selfish motives. I want to be free. I want to be more human. I want to reclaim my soul.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Different from inflating my ego or looking like a good white person.
Yeah.
But I think it's okay to want our own liberation. That's part of it.
Absolutely. And we go really deeply. I mean, we could probably talk the whole rest of the time about this. I think there's others who are doing so very eloquently, but it's the piece of, so what is it? What am I gaining? Let's say, right, from doing this sort of work. And one thing I will say is that from what I've experienced and learned, systems like white supremacy and like patriarchy, one of the moves that they require of the folks who get the privileges, who are right on the side of the oppressors, is to shut down sensation, right? And I think that's from, I hold a value that we're collectively, we're deeply collectively connected, right? Inherently connected. And so when others are suffering, and especially if we're in the presence of that suffering, we're going to feel that. That's going to have an impact on us that is hard to hold. And the options in that space are not let that happen, act to take change there as we get into act, or B, not feel that thing, not feel it, right? And so for these systems to perpetuate themselves, they require those of us who have carried the privileges to suppress those emotions. But what ends up happening over time is that we are not fully alive. We become dulled down. And that's not just in relationships with, let's say, folks of color, Black people, Indigenous people, but specifically also with everyone, right? With our white friends too, right? The depth of relationship is much less because we don't have that emotional and sensational attunement to each other, right? This is a little of my somatics training coming in here, right? Resmaa Menakem, his book, My Grandmother's Hands, really goes into this deeply as well. And yet, right, it's like, so that's an individual thing, but just to bring it back to the collective is that what happens when we become more emotionally in tune with ourselves and others is that then we're more aware of how we're impacting other folks at the same time because we're reading each other more deeply, more intimately, right? So we can more tell when you're in a space and, ooh, did what I just say impact that person negatively, right? And so while it is serving us, because again, the feeling of sensation and aliveness is what gives, one of the many things that gives life so much richness, right, to it. And at the same time, it also allows us to be more connected to others,
Mhm.
right? So,
I really appreciate that. I wrote a piece recently called "The Numbness in Our White Hearts,"
mm,
and told a simple story of one of my first diversity workshops, and sitting there on the spot, expected to give an empathic reflection to a Black woman who just told a very poignant story, and I couldn't feel anything.
yeah,
And that was transformative for me to encounter that numbness, encounter the horrifying truth,
yes,
you know, of how little I was actually there.
yep,
And think what you just did is gave you articulated that story I told and why that happens.
mm, mm,
And it makes sense,
yeah,
right? There's suffering there. I don't want to feel it, so I separate. And that's why a lot of us, especially as white men, live up here.
yes, yeah,
You know, in my own coaching work, many of my clients are white men.
uh-huh.
And a lot of the work is saying, hey, when you're living up here, you're missing out on a lot.
Yeah,
A
yeah,
lot of There's a lot of wisdom everywhere from, you know, here on down.
that's right, that's right.
Wisdom and pleasure, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, bodily sensation. And this is a whole tangent, but just to speak to it briefly, and also Wide Awake, the organization Wide Awake does some work around this. But there is also some analysis around how that came to be in white people, and specifically looking at in Europe, the time in which there was the seizing of the commons, which had been when there was space that was understood to be collective and collectively taken care of by various European ethnicity, different ethnicities in their different places. Those were seized. Those collective spaces where they would farm and take care of were taken by the royals, the lords, and all of that, walled off, and then they would charge people to use it. And that collective trauma that occurred in that time, and then industrialization followed on the heels of that, mass poverty started, and all of that trauma that really came out went unhealed. And from my shamanic lens, I think that part of the reason that was is because before that, you had the Roman Empire come through and suppress all of the native, both pagan and shamanic traditions, and kind of put Christianity over it as a way of trying to unify their empire. And so a lot of those, and then you had things like the Inquisition and things like that. So a lot of that wisdom that was the indigenous wisdom of European traditions was lost due to this. And so when these traumatic events happened, we didn't have that healing. What do I do with this? Suppress, move up here, and then that creates a larger culture that's moving from here and missing these sensations and the wisdoms of the body. So.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, you know, losing our indigenous roots and the collective trauma that we've experienced as people of European descent. These are important themes, because if we're carrying those wounds around and acting from those wounds, how are we supposed to hold space or be present with anyone else? Right? You're muted.
Yeah, I have a question for you, which was when you encounter that numbness, right? When you told that Black woman told her story, what did you do with that?
Well, so this is a workshop with Le Moonwa, creator of The Color of Fear, and he was facilitating. And what he said to me, he actually acknowledged that I was honest.
Mm.
He said, I've never had a white man just say he was numb like that.
Yeah.
Right? I thought he was going to yell at me or kick me out of the workshop or something.
Right.
And then he said what was going on. I said, you know, to live in a white supremacist culture, as a white person, you have to shut down parts of your own humanity and your own soul.
That's right.
But if you keep showing up and keep listening to people of color, you're and feeling what's there. It might be fear. Maybe all you feel is fear at first.
Yeah.
That process of showing up again and again is what will thaw your heart. And it's true. It's been happening. It's still happening.
Yeah.
There's a lifetime of work to go.
Yes.
Right?
Yep. Yeah.
So
deep inner work to do, and action to take inside of all of that.
yeah, so it's that cycle, right? The inner work makes us available and present so we can take effective action.
Correct. Yep.
So let's shift to action, and there's a framework that I think is really helpful. So what we're going to do in a moment is go through this website called White Accomplices that has a lot of specific actions, but it's at the top of the website. It has this framework. It talks about actors, allies, and accomplices. Yeah. Everything's organized around these levels, and I guess I'm not totally comfortable with levels, right? It's not like accomplices are better than allies that are better than actors, but maybe it's more of a developmental model.
Yeah.
For how white people can engage at whatever level of, you know, comfort or discomfort is a stretch for you. So could you just start with that concept and explain, just sort of in your words, what are those three levels and what do they mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So we use this model in Stand, and so you know, very very grateful to White Accomplices for this. But yeah, so actor, ally, and accomplice. So actor is basically someone who, you know, may, let's say, agree in some sense that racism is bad, right? But they're basically not making any public statements or really talking about race with friends or really doing anything at all. They may have the psychological thing like, yeah, racism's bad, but there's not much investment there, right? I think they use the metaphor that they're like a spectator of a game, right? They're just kind of sitting on the sidelines and, you know, so not much action happening there. And like you said, right, this is more of like a developmental model, right? So for each one of us as white folks, and then also if you're doing organizing work, organizing for others, it's like also identifying either where we're at or where other folks are at, and where there's space or opportunity to maybe call folks into the next space, right? So from actor, we move into ally, right? And so this is one where we're starting to get into some action, right? We're actually starting to take some action, and we're starting to actually challenge things like institutionalized racism and white supremacy, and maybe like a disruptor in some sense. So maybe actually in conversations with friends, actually someone tells a racist joke or something and actually interrupting that and saying, hey, that was racist, and let's talk about that, right? Maybe posting some things on Facebook, and also, right, starting to develop some sense at least of accountability, right, to BIPOC folks, right? So starting to find ways in which to commit to certain actions and then follow through on those actions. So that's actor, and then ally, and then accomplice, sort of the next layer after ally, which is where we're directly challenging institutionalized racism, colonialism, and white supremacy. And that also comes from, I love that they say this on their website, but it comes from that realization that our liberations are bound together, right? And so that at this point, really coming into the accomplice frame, it's less about the ally. This is how I read their interpretation a little bit, is that like ally, there's still a little bit of like, I'm helping others, right? And as we move into accomplice, it's like, this is for like, we're in this together. This is me and you, same liberation. And here maybe we start to move into actions such as various direct actions, maybe even risking arrest, and you know, continuing the work that we're doing as an ally, right? It's not that we necessarily forget that work, but going deeper into those relationships of accountability and deeper into direct action work. Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful. I want to share my honest reaction still. When I first saw it, and still, I hear accomplice and something in me tightens up. That choice of words is really interesting. It's like an accomplice in a crime. Right? And I grew up with two parents who were lawyers, like very law-abiding humans, and you know, and liberal and anti-racist and in all the ways. But I hear accomplices and crime, and it's interesting what that brings up, because a lot of really the edgier anti-racist work is a crime against a system that's unjust.
That's right.
So there's something to unwire in me. It's like, well, is it crime is bad, right? Well, crime against what? Who made those laws?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of discomfort there. And I you know, I look at these different areas, and we'll go into the 12 different areas, but I see them, and some of them I'm an actor. Some of them I'm an ally. Some of them I'm an accomplice.
Right.
It's not like I'm an accomplice or an ally across the board.
That's a great point. That's a great point, right? White Accomplices also brings in this model, like you said, there's these different ways. So we might be even an actor in one and an accomplice in the other, right? So that's a really great point. And thank you also for naming just like the discomfort of it. I think it's real because these these pieces of, white supremacy is bound up with our identification of self, right? With the ego self identification. And so when it's like being an accomplice in this crime against white supremacy, it's like, but I'm going against myself, right? There's that little piece in there to work. And I feel that as well. And I'll also name that for me, I always, as I go through these things, constant thing of finding the spaces of like where guilt and shame show up. And it's interesting because when they talk about accomplice, they say accomplices aren't motivated by personal guilt or shame. They're not emotionally fragile. So that's also a thing for me of when I feel like a shame of like, I should be doing better here. I'm like, all right, maybe not the accomplice space yet in that.
Yeah, which is okay. And I've been feeling guilt and shame a lot. And I just want to ask you, maybe from your somatics background, or what do you recommend if you're a white person who's in a lot of guilt and shame? What do you do with that?
Those are the questions. I think that, when we talk about like white guilt, right? And some folks I've seen saying that, like, this is, Robin DiAngelo brings this up a lot in White Fragility, but talking about how like guilt will come up, right? Like for white people, guilt will come up. And it's interesting, white folks who are not so much in this work, I find like, you want me to feel that. And I'm like, actually, interestingly, no, that's not the goal. It's just that it will happen. And part of the work is moving with that and through that, right? And knowing that it will come up again and again. And from a somatics lens, the distinction that we make between shame and guilt, it's not just somatics, others make this distinction as well, is that, right, shame is I am bad. Guilt is I did something bad, right? And so that's important, I think, in this conversation too, especially how we work with white folks is, we can hold the humanity of a white person who says something racist or problematic and go, hey, you did something bad, but you're not bad, right? There's that hold, and there's a lot of that shaming in the culture now, where it's like, you're bad, cancel that person. And honestly, I think that everyone needs to make that decision for themselves. Like, yes, if it's not for you to hold, you can cut that person out of your life, your own decision. But I don't think it's a strategic move overall, because then who's left to talk with them if we just cancel these people out, right?
Right. I want to go one level deeper personally. It's more guilt than shame. And it's this feeling like, as I get more exposed to this work, I realize that there's infinite need.
Yeah.
And there are people working tirelessly, people working 24/7 at great expense to their own emotional, physical health.
Yes.
White people and people of color.
Yes.
And so in every moment, I'm just keenly aware that it's like, hey, there's more I can do, more I can educate myself. And then there's like, go to the beach, take a bike ride, take a break. And it's like, I'm more aware of the cost of those breaks, right? Do you have any suggestions? I don't think it's productive to torture myself over it.
Yeah.
But any suggestions for how to work with that feeling like there's infinite need right now?
Yeah, the infinite need. Just to say, like, the guilt and shame, it gets complex, but guilt can often point to where work can be done, right? Shame, actually, what it does is often keep us from what's more difficult to deal with below the surface, right? So when there's shame, it's a way of taking back, especially when we talk about in trauma, it's a way of taking back agency, because shame goes, I am bad, and if I change, then I could change the situation. Whereas the truth is, often with trauma and some of these things, which is true here, is that even if we did all of the, like, you see, you and I, we stop everything else we're doing, the rest of our lives, we just pound the pavement, and all we do 24/7 every day is just anti-racist work. When we die, we're laying on our deathbeds, racism will still exist in some form. Right?
Yeah.
It's heavy. And that reality, that's what shame is trying to keep us away from. The reality that this is the rest of our lives, and probably our children's lives, right? And that realization, right, then brings in the piece of, well, then I have to, if this is every day, and if this is so heavy, right, it's so heavy, that reality, we're not going to be able to continue moving and doing the work that needs to get done if we're crumbled by how heavy that is. Yeah. And that's where resilience comes in, right? Going to the beach, going for a walk, looking in the trees, seeing the beauty of nature, right? these pieces, that's what buoys us, right? To be able to keep coming back to the work again and again and again.
That's really helpful. There are a few pieces there. One is, as you said all that, what I was getting in touch with is grief. Because there's a component of this that we just can't fix.
Yeah.
We can do our best. We can be, give everything we got, and there's still grief to be felt.
Yeah.
So to feel it.
Yes.
And
let it inform you.
Yeah, thank you. And titrate it. Don't have to feel it all at once, but even this is helpful to soften.
Totally.
And speaking to sustainability. How is this sustainable for us?
Yeah.
How are we? And that's actually a very rational calculation in some ways.
Totally.
It's like, what's the best ROI on my passion, my energy, my talents?
Yeah.
It's not to burn myself out and in the next 2 months.
Right.
As the news cycle is hot.
Yes.
Right. It's to make those deeper, longer term, slower commitments.
Yeah. And I've struggled with that. There's some other pressures in my life that in this particular moment, like it's such a galvanizing moment. And, I'm comfortable with the work I've been doing in this time and continue to do. And there's a space where I'm like, could be doing more. I've had to be really real with myself that I'm a little spread thin given these other stressors in my life, and that I need to take space at certain times to continue to fill myself up so that when I show up here or I show up, in the various other organizing, that I'm present, that I'm bringing my best self, because that is going to be way more effective than like a completely depleted Tyler doing all the things.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you. So here we are. We're ready for action.
We're ready.
And this is about the right proportion. I actually think there's a lot of time needed to get centered and get ourselves in a good place. So what I want to do is invite you to share your screen, Tyler.
Yeah, great.
Pull up whiteaccomplices.org. And I don't actually think we need a ton of time on this because it's really self-explanatory.
Yes.
But basically, so here's the website.
Yeah. And here's what we just talked about.
We talked about these 3 levels, and you can read about those. And then you go down here.
Act.
And there are these 12 different areas of action, which I think a lot of us are just wanting. It's like, what do I do? Well, here you go.
Yeah.
Here are 12 different areas. Could you just talk us through them? I guess they don't have titles on them. So however you want to, maybe you click on them and give us a little tour, just however you want. I'd love a tour.
I'll click into them. And so the first one is your protesting, little megaphone. So like an actor might, attend marches, vigils that are comfortable, maybe even fun, right? Which is great. And many events led by white people, right? Cool. So ally moves into organizing maybe protests that interrupt business as usual, right? And accomplice then engaging and supporting in civil disobedience, right? Direct action work. Yeah.
Great. So I don't think we need to get through all of them because, again, they're pretty self-explanatory, but let's just stay here and talk about how you'd use this website. So you go to this area of protest and you see the different columns.
Exactly.
And I guess the first thing I do is I just notice, okay, where am I?
Yes.
Here.
Yes.
And I'll be honest, in this one, I'm more of an actor. I haven't been going to protests. That's not been my main mode of engagement. So I guess what comes up for me is saying, okay, am I drawn to do more of this?
Right.
Maybe even at a higher level, like the ally level.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I can get really specific, right? Like, okay, what I specifically do? Maybe I, look on some of my email lists for protests or Google it. Yeah. What else would you say about how to use this tool?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's like identifying yourself in this space firstly. And I think, as you said, we're going to go through all of these and looking, because in other places where, again, there's the should, which there's the should in the one hand, and there's also the like, where is there the passion, right? And then also I'd say the third one is where there's skills. So there's as we go through these, it's like, okay, which of these I'm like, ooh, in this moment, this feels like something I should do. But if it's like, but I'm an introvert, I hate large crowds, maybe this one isn't for you, right? Like maybe actor's okay, that's okay, right? But it's like, where's the passion as we go through here? Maybe there's passion for various other ways, right? And then where the skill set that maybe you could lend to that. So I'm always also looking for those 3 different things as we go through. And then,
I really like that, because it's not saying we have to do it all.
right.
That
No,
would be crazy to say, 12 different areas and we need to do all 12 is just going to spread us too thin.
and
So,
I would suggest that pull to feel like I need to do it all is based in individualism, which is inherently tied to patriarchy and white supremacy itself, right?
good point.
The collective is, maybe this isn't me, but there's someone else who can do this.
Mm-hmm.
There's someone else who's going to want to do this,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and then another way, just using this as I go through, they have resources down below, right, in this section.
Oh,
so
cool.
That's also helpful. Should we go to the next section?
Yeah, let's do a few of these.
Cool. So you have that one. You have your money. This one. This is a great one for those of us who have access to resources. Upper middle class, wealthy and owning class folks. So again, the actors need to donate to political candidates or organizations that don't have explicit racial justice mission, but right, maybe are on like the side of things. So like maybe like the Democratic Party, right? Although that could be argued that maybe it's not always helpful, but I would say that's in line with that, right? And then allies moving in to donate money explicitly to organizations that have racial justice missions, right? And then accomplices starting to raise funds and bundle money for organizations. So maybe like you're actually reaching out, you're part of a campaign that's organizing and raising money, reaching out to the people that you know.
Great.
Should I just go through a few more?
Let's do one more.
Okay,
I'm
one
just
more.
keeping an eye on the time and know you have something to do with one. So
Yeah, thank you. What's another good one? I think is this the the children one. Let's do the children one. I like this one. So kids, or even though I don't have any kids, but when working with youth, so actor would be ensuring that the reading material you provide your children explicitly addresses issues of justice and equity, right? Exposing children to books, movies, other forms of media that feature people of color as protagonists and heroes, right? And being in public schools, not private schools, if possible. And at least choosing schools where there's clear social justice inspired mission. It's possible in some places more than others. And an ally would, could look like enrolling your kids in schools where they're a racial minority. Taking your kids to events where, there are adults or even other youth speaking about racism, right? There are many family-friendly protests and going on and other events happening these days. And can start talking more explicitly and more in depth with your kids about these sort of organizations. And then some things from an accomplice could look like taking your children to events. This is an interesting distinction they're making here. I see taking your kids to events that are organized or have facilitators, who are kids of color, right? Or Black kids or Indigenous kids. I think that's an interesting distinction there. So actually bringing them into relationship with folks who are doing this work in their own age group, right? And another example, talk to your child's teacher if you see them teaching in culturally problematic ways. I think that's a huge one that I know. We see some internet videos about it, and I've definitely heard about it happening with some of my friends who have kids too. So
yeah. Thank you so much. This is such a it's just such a useful tool. So I encourage anyone watching this to go to whiteaccomplices.org, and it took me about half an hour to read through them all slowly, digest them, identify where I was in each of them. And then maybe we could suggest picking maybe 3 areas you want to stretch in. And then writing down some specific next steps. That's right. And always, it's that simple, right?
That simple. And then taking action on those things, writing them down, right? Looking into, and then another piece I would suggest is, if you're not part of an organization, if you are part of an organization, an anti-racist organization, this may be built in some sense, but, coming with someone who, or finding someone in your life who you think would be able to hold you accountable. Ideally, probably another white person who'd be able to hold you accountable to those actions, right? And set up another future time to check in with them. So it's like letting them know these are the things I'm going to do. I'm going to do them by this date. Let's check in by that date. And again, it's like, if you don't do these things, not space necessarily for shaming each other,
Mm-hmm.
but for, again, lifting up and supporting, being like, great, you didn't do it. That means you still have the opportunity to do it. Make it happen.
Yeah. As two coaches, we both believe in accountability.
That's right. That's right.
Accountability is so important.
Yeah.
Making those commitments real.
My cat thinks so too.
Oh, hey, Kitty.
Yeah, this is Cleo.
Thanks for joining the conclusion of our live.
Come on.
Well, Tyler, as we close up here, I want to invite you to share how people can get in touch with you.
Sure.
And any projects you're working on or anything else you want to share.
Yeah, thank you. They can get in touch with me. I'm happy to share my email, which is Tyler Grillo 23, just my name, Tyler Grillo 23 at gmail.com. And, also doing work with Stand. Our website is standbayarea.com. You can sign up for the newsletter there. Also, feel free to reach out to me directly if you'd like to get involved with Stand. And Peter, very grateful for this space. Yeah,
and for your coaching work, your somatic coaching.
Oh yeah, my website is Whole Heartwood, WHOLE, and then Heartwood, like the center of a tree. Yeah,
I love that. And I think your website is also worth reading just as a model for how to talk about transformational work and social awareness, in the same context. So,
thanks, Peter. It means a lot coming from you.
Yeah. So check that out. Like I mentioned, there's a workshop series coming up for white people that I'm co-leading with two incredible Black facilitators, Galen Logan and Wanda Whitaker. It's called Free Yourself First. It's about healing and it's about action. So we're covering all of it over 3 weeks in August. And 55% of the profits are going to Village Connect, which is Galen Logan's agency, which supports the Black community in San Leandro.
That's great.
So it's for good cause, inviting my community to join, and you can check that out at racialhealing.net. That will be up very shortly.
Love it. Peter, thanks for doing that. That's super exciting. And thanks again for bringing on these folks. I've seen a few other the lives that you've been doing, and just so much wisdom and just like heartfelt authenticity. So grateful.
Thank you. And thank you for being our guest today. I think this was really enjoyable for me, and I think incredibly useful for people watching. So
enjoyed it as well. Yeah, hope folks get a lot out of it.
Good. All right. Take care.
All right. You too.